Suddenly there was a sound of a car engine, and all heads turned as one.
Can't get her started, Ned?
Don Martin called out to him. No dice. Funny, she was working fine this morning. And then, without warning, the car started up all by itself and idled smoothly, smoking briefly, coming out of the exhaust. Ned Rosin whirled around and stared at us wide with his eyes. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the engine sputtered and stopped. Started all by itself! How could it do that? How could it just start all by itself? Sally Bishop let loose her son's arms and just stood there, shaking her head. How in the world? Then there were no more questions. They stood there staring at Ned Rosin, who looked from them to his car and then back again. He went to the car and looked at it. Then he scratched his head again.
Somebody explain it to me. I sure never saw anything like that before.
He never did come out to look at that thing that flew overhead. Wasn't even interested. What do you say we, ask him some questions? There was a chorus of us, and 15 people started across the street toward Ned Rosin's driveway. Unity was restored. They had a purpose, a feeling of activity and direction. They were doing something. They weren't sure what, but Ned Rosin was flesh and blood, askable, reachable, and seeable. He watched with growing apprehension as his neighbors marched toward him. They stopped on the sidewalk close to the driveway and surveyed him. Ned Rosin pointed to his car. I just don't understand it. No more than you do. I tried to start it and it wouldn't start. You saw me. All of you saw me. His neighbors seemed massed against him, solidly and alarmingly. I don't understand it. I swear I don't understand it. What's happening? Charlie Farnsworth stood out in front of the others. Maybe you'd better let us tell us. Nothing's working on this street. Nothing. No lights, no power, no radio, no nothing. Except your car. Yours. Come on, Rosin. Let's hear what you have to say about it. Let's hear how you explain your car starting like that. Ned Rosin wasn't a coward. He was a quiet man who didn't like violence and had never been a physical fighter. But he didn't like being bullied either. And he got mad. Hold it! Just hold it! You keep your distance, all of you. All right, I've got a car that starts all by itself. Well, that's a freak thing. I admit that. But does that make me some sort of a criminal or something? I don't know why your car works. It just does. The crowd were neither sober nor assured by Rosin's words, but they were not frightened to listen. They huddled together, mumbling. Ned Rosin's eyes went from face to face till he stopped on Steve Brand's. Ned knew Steve Brand. All of the men on the street, this seemed the guy with the most substance, the most intelligence, the most essential decency. What's this all about, Steve? We're all on a monster kick, Ned. Seems that general impression holds that maybe one family isn't what we think they are. Monsters from outer space or something. Different from us. 15 columnists from the vast beyond. He couldn't keep the sarcasm out of his voice. Do you know anybody around here who might fit the description? Steve Brand sensed a special danger now. Look, let's forget this right now. Then Charlie Farnsworth cut him off. Go ahead. Let him talk. What about? Explain what? His voice, with an air of great reluctance, said, well, sometimes I go to bed late at night, and a couple of times, just a couple of times, I've come out on the porch, and I've seen Ned Rosin here in the wee hours of the morning, staring out in front of his house, looking up at the sky. He looked about the circle of faces. That's right, looking up at the sky as if he were waiting for something. He paused for emphasis, for dramatic effect. As if he were looking for something, he repeated. The nail on the coffin, Steve Brand thought. One dumb, ordinary, simple idiocracy of a human being, and that probably was all it would take. He could hear the murmuring of the crowd rise and saw Ned Rosin's face turn white. Rosin's wife, Anne, came out on the porch. She looked at the crowd and then at her husband, and with an expression like, "What's going on?" Ned turned to her and says, I don't know what they're talking about. Gee, the car starts off by itself, honey. I don't know. But I don't like what they're doing. I don't like them standing on my yard like that. And if any one of them takes another step and gets close to my porch, I'll break his jaw. I swear to God that's what I'll do. I'll break his jaw. Now go on, get out of here, all of you. Get the heck out of here. None of them eager to start an action, so they therefore backed away. But they had an obscure sense of gratification. At least there was an opponent now, someone who wasn't one of them, and this gave them a kind of vague feeling of security. The enemy had a front porch, and a front yard, and a car, and he had shouted threats at them. They started slowly back across the street, forgetting for the moment what they'd started out for, forgetting that there was no power, no telephones, forgetting even that there had been a meteor overhead not 20 minutes earlier. It wasn't until much later, as a matter of fact, that anyone posed a certain question. Old Mr. Van Horn had walked through his backyard over to Brannett Avenue. He'd never come back. Where was he? It was not one of the questions that passed through the minds of any of the 30 or 40 people on Maple Street who sat there on their front porches and watched the night come and felt the new menacing darkness close in on them. There were lanterns lit all along Maple Street by 10 o'clock. Candles shone through living rooms and windows and cast flickering, unsteady shadows all along the street. Groups of people huddled on their front lawns around their lanterns, and soft murmuring voices were carried over the Indian summer night. All eyes eventually were drawn to Ned Rosin's house. He sat there on the railing, observing the little points of light spotted around in the darkness. He knew he was surrounded. He was an animal at bay. And then all of a sudden the lights went on in Charlie Farnsworth's house, and they shone brightly on the people on Maple Street. They looked suddenly naked. They blinked foolishly at the lights, and their mouths gaped like fishes. "Charlie, how come you're the only one with the lights on now?" The question came out of the night to land against the fat, wet cheeks of Charlie. "You were so quick to kill, and you were so quick to tell us who we should be careful of. Well, maybe you had to kill, Charlie. Maybe Pete Van Horn, God rest his soul, was trying to tell us something. Maybe he'd found out something and had to come back to tell us who there was among us that we should watch out for." Charlie's eyes were little pits of growing fear as he backed away from the people and found himself up against a bush in front of his house. No, please, 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 I swear to you, it isn't me. It really isn't." Like a hippopotamus in a circle, he scrambled over the bushes, tearing his clothes and scratching his face and arms. His wife tried to run toward him, and somebody stuck a foot out and tripped her. Sprawling headfirst on the sidewalk, another stone whistled through the air and hit Charlie on the back of the head as he raced across his front yard toward his porch. "It isn't me, but I know who it is." The people stopped motionless as statues. He was a fat figure of a man who smiled now through the tears and the blood that cascaded down his face. "Well, I'm going to tell you. I am now going to tell you because I know who it is. I really know who it is." Charlie tried to think. He tried to come up with a name. A nightmare engulfed him. Fear whipped at the back of his brain. "It's the kid! That's who it is! It's the kid!" Sally Bishop grabbed at Tommy, burying his face against hers. "He knew! He was the only one who knew! He told us all about it! Well, how did he know? How could he have known? Who told him? Make the kid answer!" A fever had taken hold now. A hot, burning virus that twisted faces and forced words and solidified the terror inside each person on Maple Street. Tommy broke away from his mother and started to run. A man dove at him and made a flying tackle and missed. Another man threw a stone wildly toward the darkness. They began to run down the street. And then suddenly the lights went on in another house. A two-story gray stucco house that belonged to Bob Weaver. "It isn't the kid, it's Bob Weaver's house!" A porch light went on at Mrs. Sharp's house. "It isn't Bob Weaver's house, it's Mrs. Sharp's place! I tell you, it's the kid! It's Charlie, he's the one!" They ran this way and that way over to the house, and then they ran back across the street to another. A rock flew through the air, and then another. Lights on and off, on and off. Charlie Farnsworth went down on his knees. There was a piece of brick plot, a 2-inch hole in the back of his skull. Mrs. Sharp lay on her back and felt the tearing jab of a woman's high heel in her mouth as someone stepped on her racing across the street. From a quarter of a mile away on a hilltop, Maple Street looked like this. A long tree-lined avenue, full of lights going on and off, and people racing back and forth. Maple Street was a bedlam. It was an outdoor asylum for the insane. Up on top of a hill, two men screened by the darkness stood near the entrance to a spaceship and looked down on Maple Street. "Understand the procedure now? Just stop a few of their machines and radios and telephones and lawnmowers. Throw them into darkness for a few hours, and then watch the pattern unfold." "And is this the pattern all the time?" "With a few variations. They pick the most dangerous enemy they can find, and it's themselves. All we need do is sit back and watch." "Then I take it this place is full of Maple Streets, is it not?" "Yes, it is. The world is full of Maple Streets, and we'll go just from one to another and let them destroy themselves." When the sun came up on Maple Street the following morning, it was silent. Most of the houses had been burned down. There were a few bodies lying on sidewalks, draped over porch railings and like that, but the silence was total. There simply was no more life. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, there was no more world, or at least not the kind of world that had greeted the morning. And by Wednesday afternoon of the following week, a new set of residents had moved into Maple Street. They were a handsome race of people indeed. Their faces showed great character and excellent shaped heads. Excellently shaped heads, two to each new resident. The tools of conquest do not essentially come with bombs and explosions and fallout. There are weapons that are simple thoughts, attitudes, and prejudices to be found only in the minds of men. For the record, prejudices can kill, suspicion can destroy, and a thoughtless, frightened search for a scapegoat has a fallout all of its own for the children and the children yet unborn. And the pity of it is that these things cannot be confined. So, stay awake.